We expect the Washington State Legislature to produce a bill that will not decriminalize drugs, will provide measures for treatment, and will provide some sanction for those who fail to accept treatment.
That's Governor Jay Inslee laying out his expectations for the state legislature as it enters a special session this week to deal with our state's drug possession law, a session that apparently could end very quickly based on some new reports coming out. Plus, what are we left with after a multi-million-dollar decision regarding former Mayor Jenny Durkan and her missing texts? And what expectations should we have as the filing deadline approaches for candidates? There are more than 40 so far and counting for the Seattle City Council. Well, we have all this and more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own, and I am joined by my co-host, David Croman, transportation reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, I always watch your Twitter feed because you got great stuff on there, and I saw your recent conundrum with the hot weather we've had over the past few days. You wanted to open that window in the upstairs office there, but it looks like you might get some visitors if you do. What's going on?
Well, I think it's because there's like a lot of bugs that hang out under the awning in my upstairs room, but I've got birds that like to perch right on the window, and I'm scared that if I open the window, they're all going to come flying in. So I just bake up here in my little sauna.
Yeah, it's all right. It's good for the brain. A lot of good heat waves going on there, I'm sure.
Right.
Well, thank you, David, as always, for joining me. Thanks to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. John, hope you're doing well there. Thanks also to our show patrons. The Seattle News, Views, and Brews sticker campaign is alive and well, and we definitely need your help here, folks. If you could, please join us as a supporter of the show. You get your very own decal for just a $5 a month pledge. We like to also feature photos of our stickers in action on the show, too. Angie sent in a couple, not just one on her vacuum, but on her composting bin, too. Forget about it. That's when you know you have hit it big. So thank you very much for that, Angie, for sending that in. Thanks for sticking with us. Appreciate the support there. Thanks finally to Converge Media. We partner with Converge to air the video version of this podcast. Check it out on Converge's YouTube channel, Wednesdays at 7. Off we go with right here, right now. Well, it's the middle of May and time for a special session of the state legislature, just about 3 weeks after they wrapped up the regular session. On the docket with this session, that one issue, a big one, that lawmakers in Olympia could not come to agreement on after 105 days, how to create a new drug possession statute in our state, with the current one expiring on July 1st. David, it could very well be that the legislature votes on this as our podcast is getting released, because it appears from the reports I'm seeing that wisely they have brokered some sort of agreement on this even before starting this special session. I've seen this in the Times and other sources too. It looks like lawmakers want to reduce the maximum sentence for certain possession convictions, and also maybe not push so hard to stop cities and counties from making their own laws around drug paraphernalia. I know I'm painting in broad strokes there, but what are you seeing with this special session?
Yeah, my immediate take is, the Democrats, who of course are in power, most of the Democrats seem to be going about it in a way to try and get Republican votes rather than, which is interesting that seems to be the kind of easier path here, rather than trying to run something that will unite the entire Democratic caucus. And I think that's probably right, because I think there is we saw it at the end of the session. I think there's a not insignificant number of Democrats who just don't want to recriminalize this at all, or at the most would maybe consider a misdemeanor with a maximum 90-day jail sentence. But the majority of the Democrats are in favor of recriminalizing drug possession somehow, and in the form of a gross misdemeanor. So this appears to be a shot at trying to pull some Republican votes over, because I do think, I'd say we some of the defectors on the Democratic side might end up voting in favor of this, but I would assume that we'll still see a good number of Democrats who vote against this. And so that would require some kind of bipartisan agreement here. And this appears to be a kind of shot at that.
Right, trying to find that middle ground there. I did think it was interesting, though, David, because included with this whole idea about the penalty for possession, there's talk about creating this new statewide crime for the knowing use of drugs in a public place, and this would be separate from the crime of drug possession. I feel like this is sort of taken a look at what the city of Bellingham has done, what the city of Seattle is considering when it's talking about public use of drugs. Let's touch on that piece, because I think the state and the cities at least have some different ideas about what that should look like.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if part of the reason this is, the one thing that I think lawmakers are really trying to avoid is too much of a patchwork of laws across the state. And so the fact, I think, that some cities are either considering or already have passed legislation to criminalize, that kind of knowing use of drug possession. In some ways, you could see this as an acknowledgement of that's happening already. And so the state sort of at least trying to set some kind of basic framework that the entire state has to follow. I think it's probably also an acknowledgement just of some of, probably of Third Avenue, frankly, if you want to get really specific about it, just that, that's a tough area and lawmakers want to do something about that. I think that piece is going to sit especially poorly with some of the progressive Democrats who didn't want to vote to recriminalize drug possession at all. And I also wouldn't expect, at least in Seattle, for that to be enforced all that often, frankly. But again, it's I think that the pendulum has swung a little bit back toward a little bit harsher of an approach, not a exactly war on drugs approach here, but something that is a little certainly north of decriminalization. And, I think that reflects this.
Yeah. And I think a lot of this played out in the session that we just had when it comes to police car chases, for example. I mean, there was definitely a swinging back there when you saw some of the rhetoric that was started with and where the legislature ended up. One last piece on this whole drug law bit, David. I wanted to talk about this idea because the state's been talking about this well, maybe trying to balance from regulating drug paraphernalia, but maybe not too much. It looked like, at least from what I've seen, there's an exception that would allow them to make some sort of laws related to the establishment or regulation of harm reduction services. And I thought that was an interesting wrinkle here too, because I think a lot of these people who operate these harm reduction services, I'm talking about needle exchanges, things of that nature, say their services are very important. But I know in some circles, that's really not seen as something that people want, these places for needle exchanges, et cetera. Any final thoughts on that piece?
Yeah, that's interesting. Part of me thinks that could be sort of a hedge against safe consumption sites, maybe. Not that those are imminent, as we have seen, but I do think in conservative parts of the state there is fear that sort of Seattle's approach to harm reduction will somehow spread into their communities or whatever, and they don't like that. I don't know how many harm reduction programs are in kind of the communities right now that would probably take advantage of this regulation right now. My hunch is probably not that many. If it's not a welcoming community to that sort of thing, it's they probably have already kind of made it hard for those to open up. But it is kind of it's a bone being tossed to communities that want some control over how drugs are regulated without kind of opening the doors to cities and counties passing kind of their own version of this drug law. And again, back to the patchwork, trying to avoid the patchwork approach. This is clearly trying to sort of balance the local control while not sort of undermining what the state is trying to do on a broad level.
Yeah, quite a balancing act there. Thank you for that, David. I wanted to move on to another topic here with you. A new vision for Memorial Stadium right there on the campus of Seattle Center. The Seattle City Council taking this up as a non-binding resolution this week. They're looking to put in more than $66 million in school levy money, together with $21 million from the city's capital improvement plan. You got $4 million from the state, and then hopefully $40 million from a private investor to reimagine and rebuild Memorial Stadium. And this is where it gets a little interesting, David. I've seen it in the Times and other occasions too. The city is mulling two options for the private developer. You got One Roof, connected to the group that won the bid to rebuild Climate Pledge Arena, and JAL and POAG, which is the company that lost out on the bid to rebuild that arena. Call me crazy here, but it really seems like the city would be leaning towards the One Roof proposal on this. Some thoughts about where the city might go here.
Yeah, I can't predict, but I guess it depends on the experiences they had with that company at Climate Pledge. I wasn't following it that closely. My sense is basically positive. I mean, of course, it became more expensive than originally planned, although that was not really, there wasn't really any skin off the city's back because it was privately funded. And everything was getting more expensive, so I don't know that that would be disqualifying for this contractor.
Mhm.
So yeah, I can't make any prediction. It makes some amount of logical sense to have the contractor that knows its way around the city, the Seattle Center area, and can just kind of
Yeah.
move its crews a little bit
Yeah.
to the
Right
east or
next door.
whatever it
Yeah.
is.
Mhm.
And, so yeah, I mean that'll be interesting. It's interesting. This is finally moving. The city's been talking
Mhm.
about Memorial Stadium and this corner of
Yeah.
Seattle Center for a really long time. I don't know if it's personal connection exactly, but where I used to work at Crosscut, and the Crosscut
Mhm.
offices are at the
Yeah.
KCTS building there, and that building was really part of those discussions. And in fact, KCTS and Crosscut are moving out of that building because the city wanted that land. And so
Yeah.
there was actually really under Ed Murray, there was kind of a lot of momentum to turn that whole kind of, what is it, northeast corner of Seattle Center into something more inviting. But this is the first amount of progress we've seen on it in a while.
It's interesting to see it too, David, because I'm very interested in seeing how this changes from a very municipal stadium. I go there to see my kid play in band performances and things like that. To move from that kind of municipal type of everyman kind of a stadium into something that has a lot more of a professional feel to it. They're talking about having Seawolves rugby there, the Rain play soccer there, the Orcas play cricket there. I mean, all these professional teams coming in. How does that change the vibe, change the ethic? Because Seattle Center hasn't had that in that corner of the campus.
No, you're right. I mean, it is just sort of probably the kind of central high school stadium at this point. I mean, it's
Hmm.
along with some kind of hot afternoons during Bumper Shoot or whatever
You
on the
got
AstroTurf
it.
down
Yeah.
there. It always felt like it always felt like just a slightly larger version of a high school stadium. I don't know, frankly, again, haven't been following this that closely. I don't understand entirely the motivation to put a lot of money into this. If you're a private company, they must see some profit in this, or how this stadium's use changes as a result of putting in a bunch of money and effort into it. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I have always thought of that as exactly what you just described, which is a place that high school football happens on Friday nights or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. I get the feeling, and I might be talking out of class here, but there may be some sort of connection with the World Cup coming to the US and trying to
Mm,
turn this into a venue, maybe even a practice venue or something like that. I'm thinking big there, but that could be a piece of it too. So we shall see. But
yeah,
thank you
yeah.
for the back and forth on that. Up next, very interesting one here too, a settlement about former Mayor Jenny Durkan and the deleted text that she has. You know those headlines. This is one of those settlements that to me doesn't feel settled at all. We're talking about it next on Now Hear This. Well, in case you missed it last week, a story a bit buried on a Friday afternoon. The city of Seattle will pay $2.3 million to settle a lawsuit brought on by some city employees who revealed back in 2021 that Jenny Durkan, mayor at the time, had deleted thousands of texts related to the CHOP, the protest, the civil unrest of the summer of 2020. The former mayor had told reporters soon afterwards she had nothing to hide.
I can promise you that any text message we have, whether it's related to East Precinct or anything else, if we've got it, it'll be produced.
Well, the terms of this deal for Stacey Irwin and Kimberly Ferrero, the employees who sued, they have to drop the suit, destroy any city documents they have, and never work for the city again. Don't think they have a problem with that last part there. The tough one for me, though, David, and the plaintiffs brought this up in Daniel Beekman's article in the Times, we're never going to know what was in those texts. What do you feel about the settlement?
Yeah, I guess we could have seen it coming. I think it is. That's probably about the end of it on the city's side.
Hmm.
There is still the county. There is still a criminal investigation happening on the county
Right,
side.
right. Dan
At least
Satterberg
as far as
last
I
year was
know.
talking about this when he was still prosecutor, saying, "Hey, Sheriff Cole Tyndall, look into this." Haven't heard anything about that, but yeah, please keep going.
No, haven't heard anything about that. So I would say that now if we're more interested in what happened in those text messages, the kind of now the only avenue those could come out I would think would be that criminal investigation. And even then, that would probably have to mean A, charges, B, it goes to trial, and there's some discovery period that's tied to that. And that's way down the road. And of course, as you just alluded to, Dan Satterberg, the person who wanted to bring that, is not the prosecutor anymore. So I don't even know if this is actually moving forward in any kind of meaningful way. So, for people who wanted accountability, I suppose, then this is not that exactly. And I do think it probably closes off some avenues toward that. Then again, that's not unique. We see settlements that happen all the time, and in a way that the people who brought the complaints, it's good for them in a lot of ways, because they get some financial compensation. But for the public who wanted to see a little more kind of public scrutiny and accountability, we see this in sexual assault cases. We saw this with the Fox Dominion voting systems. It can be a little frustrating when these things end in a settlement.
Yeah. And I know this was a big case for the Seattle Times, and I know you don't speak for the Times here, but this whole idea of how governments respond to requests for information, I think that's a big piece of this too. And I know the city was saying afterwards, we've changed, this is going to be very different now because of this case. And I just wonder about that. Any lessons for governments here and how they actually hang on to texts? I mean, Harold Scoggins is still the chief of police, and he was wrapped up in this too. The fire chief, I should say. He was wrapped in this too, and still life goes on. He's still chief. I know that Carmen Best no longer is police chief. I know that Jenny Durkan is no longer mayor. They're involved here, but Scoggins wasn't. I try to think about how this works going forward when it comes to how information is shared by local governments when requests are made like this.
Yeah, I think this really gets at the heart of what's really weak about our freedom of information laws, which is it's very easy for people to just not comply and kind of roll the dice that primarily that just no one will notice. And I think that is what would have happened here had these two whistleblowers not come forward, which is a rare thing, that whistleblowers don't come forward all that often. So this is just two women who happened to decide to do something. And, I'm sure it was a hard time for them, and it's not easy to do that. And so I think it's in most cases, there would not be a whistleblower, and therefore we would not have ever known about that. More commonly, though, it's just that the only kind of form of accountability in public records cases like this is being sued, lawsuits. And most people, the Seattle Times was able to bring a lawsuit here, and there was some accountability from that, and there was a settlement involved. And so that is some level of accountability. But a lot of reporters and journalists, I used to work for Crosscut. We almost certainly would not have spent the time and money to sue. It's really hard to pull that together. You really have to know what you're doing. Sometimes it costs money. So I think most people, if they have filed a records request, even if they got some inclination that maybe something is being withheld that should not have been, the chances that they're going to spend the time and energy it takes to sue and take this to court is really low. And so that lets government agencies off the hook. And at your most idealistic interpretation of it, it's bad for democracy, because there are things that are being withheld that should not be withheld. So it's a pretty, this was a dramatic case because it involved the mayor and text messages and CHOP, and there were lawsuits involved. But I think the much more typical story is just kind of everyday slowness, that this process takes a really long time. Things are withheld and nobody does anything about it. So, I think this is, the proverbial tip of the iceberg of a much kind of deeper problem with public records compliance.
Yeah, it's a challenge on many different fronts. And I know the different government agencies that respond say they're overwhelmed with these requests, et cetera. But interesting to see the fallout from this. And I am hopeful that we don't see another case like that in Seattle city government anytime soon. But it's something that people need to keep an eye on. That's what watchdog reporting is all about. I wanted to move on to another story here with you, David, because it's candidate filing deadline week for the Seattle City Council. And I'm sorry, folks, if I don't run down all 43. I think there's 43 as I checked this morning, 43 names that are in the mix right now. But I was interested, David, to see Olga Sagan, owner of Piroshki, throw her name in the ring for the District 7 seat against incumbent Andrew Lewis downtown. She's been a critic of downtown public safety, shut down her 3rd Avenue location for 10 months last year. What do you make of her candidacy? Is she someone Andrew Lewis should be concerned about?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, she and Piroshki have been kind of symbolic of 3rd Avenue in some ways, I think, because it's a really popular restaurant. If you go to the Pike Place Piroshki, there's always a line out the door. She's been really vocal about issues down on 3rd Avenue, and I think 3rd Avenue has come to symbolize some of the city's challenges. So yeah, I think there's some salience there. I will say that Andrew Lewis, he was kind of viewed as the more progressive of the two in his first race. But unlike some progressives on the city, I think he works fairly closely with people downtown, and that has become kind of his I would say his priority in the last couple of years. He's working pretty closely with the Downtown Seattle Association and the Seattle Police Department. So, and I think that they get along with him pretty well. So for me, the question is kind of whether or not she ends up being a threat to Andrew Lewis sort of depends on what the big downtown players feel. I think Olga is certainly one of them, and I'm sure she has a lot of support among some people, but I do get the sense that, again, the Downtown Seattle Association and Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce have been working pretty well with Andrew Lewis. So I'm not sure if they would be willing to toss him overboard for somebody like the Piroshki owner, but we'll see.
Yeah, we will see. And one last piece on this. I wanted to talk about the gamesmanship, or whatever you want to call it here, entering a race near the filing deadline as a candidate versus getting in early and trying to build up more financial support. Does that drama of the deadline help candidates make a bigger splash? How do you look at this?
Yeah, I don't think so. Obviously, it was a different year with Ed Murray's resignation and all that. But, Jenny Durkan declared, I think, on filing day. I think it was that Friday. Nicole Thomas Kennedy declared on, and Davison actually declared on Friday afternoon on filing deadline. So I don't think it's hard to know. Maybe it helps from a fundraising standpoint to be in a little earlier. At the same time, if you file in November or whatever, you lose a little of that luster. I think you kind of maybe fade into the background. But my inclination would be that there's not a ton of strategy beyond maybe you can raise a little money if you declare earlier. But if you're well connected and you have that listserv of people who are going to donate to you, you should be able to raise money pretty quickly anyway. So I don't know. I don't think there's a lot of correlation between when you declare and how well you do.
Yeah, that's fair. I will be interested to see where those dollars start flowing here after this deadline here in May and leading up to August as we head the primaries there. So thanks for that, David. I wanted to head to our next story here. We're talking about who's in charge of mowing the lawn. A number of East Side cities are asking just that about several Highway 520 lids in their communities. A growing controversy, if you will. We're going to break it down on Transportation Talk. Well, David, you recently reported on a kerfuffle, maybe even a foo-for-all, between the communities of Clyde Hill, Yarrow Point, Medina on the east side. They pushed for lids over Highway 520 a decade ago to reduce noise, but they also got 7 acres of landscaping on top of them, and now there's a bit of a struggle over who's supposed to take care of that, these local communities or the state. What's going on here?
Yeah, it's a funny story. I'm not going to pretend like this is earth-shattering for Washington State, but it is kind of an interesting microcosm of what happens when you've got kind of dueling, when you've got two agencies who can't really agree on who's responsible for what, and it also kind of gets at some of it does actually kind of get at some of the larger issues in Washington state, particularly around WashDOT's backlog of maintenance that they have and shortages of crews, as well as the tax system in Washington state, such that places like these 4 communities that are obscenely wealthy, that wealth is not reflected in their budgets because they're dependent on property taxes, and those property taxes are pretty capped. So then you get this situation like this where the city or the state has kind of bent over backwards to build these lids and these parks over 520 to satisfy these communities and sort of mitigate a little bit some of the disruption that comes with having a highway go through your communities. But now that they were built, they realized that no one ever actually agreed on whose job it was to take care of it. And so you're in this rock and a hard place where the state is saying, we are stretched too thin. We cannot take care of these. We gave you these lids. It's your job. And the cities that are saying, we don't have any retail base. I mean, basically, these are gated communities without stores. And so there's no business tax or anything like that. So we're restricted to what we can raise in property tax, which is just not very much. And so therefore, we can't take care of these either. And it's gone on for so long, literally decades at this point, that the state has now spent over $100,000, is going to spend over $100,000 to hire a mediator to figure this thing out. So, mostly kind of a funny little story of unresolved conflict, but with, some underlying themes that I think do get at some larger issues in the state, which I find interesting.
Well, absolutely. And I know this was an important interaction between, I know if it's a different issue, but I think about the city of Seattle and the State Department of Transportation dealing with homelessness. And okay, this is state land here, state property. How are you going to take care of it? And when you start drawing these different lines of demarcation, it is interesting. And I wonder how this one is going to turn out. Did you have any feel for that, if it is going to be a shared responsibility, or where this discussion is going to go, David?
No, I didn't. For a little while, they had discussed actually putting some tolls on one of the ramps specifically to raise money to care for these, but that turned out to have some kind of legal and logistical challenges that didn't happen. So, I don't know. Maybe they run another levy, property tax levy lift and raise a little more money to take care of these. At the end of the day, it's probably about $200,000 a year. It's not that much money. But again, these are small communities with populations, as I said in the story, about the size of, some apartment buildings in Capitol Hill. There's not that many people live here. So, I genuinely don't know how they're going to resolve it.
I got to say, man, I got a lawnmower, and if you want to roll out with me, I'll split that $200K with you, man. We could find a way. I'm just saying, it's a thought.
I know.
Throw it out there.
I walked around there. I mean, they're nice. They just need a little weeding and mowing, and I'd do it for $100,000.
Oh, wait a minute! Don't undercut me, man. Come on.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we do need to wrap up here, David. I did want to ask this one question here, and I know it was just one game, but when you see the Mariners blow up for 10 runs against a fairly strong Red Sox team in Boston, does it bring you hope? Are you in the back of your mind saying, guys, save 5 runs for the next game? How do you look at that?
Yeah, the Mariners team is weird. I whenever I see a game like that, their pitching is so amazing. It's just if their offense was even mediocre, I think they would genuinely be like a World Series contender. But and so you see that with Red Sox, it's like that's the team that could win a World Series. Unfortunately, fairly good chance that tonight they'll go back to the other team that gets 2 hits against some starter you've never heard of before.
Right. I know, such a Jekyll and Hyde there, but the quest for mediocrity. I don't know if that's a good slogan for the M's, but I hear exactly what you're saying. David, thank you so much. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is on Apple, Spotify, wherever you might like to listen. Please find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon and show your support. A big thanks to Brittany, one of our new supporters here. Thanks for supporting the show. Thanks also for watching on Verge Media as well. We'll see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2023.